The Olmecs weren't the only people with missing DNA. For all three of these ancient civilizations, the Olmecs, Maya, and Teotihuacanos, their Y chromosome lineages have vanished.
A major DNA study just revealed something terrifying about the Aztecs. Something so disturbing that one of the lead researchers walked out of her own lab when the results came back. Geneticists at Harvard, Stanford, and Mexico's top research universities sequenced ancient bones from the civilizations that came before the Aztecs: the Olmec, the Maya, the Toltec, the builders of Teotihuacan. And what they found encoded in those bones changes everything we thought we knew about who the Aztecs really were. Every male bloodline from those earlier civilizations had been erased, not reduced over time, not slowly blended away, erased completely. But the female lineages survived intact. The mothers lived on. The fathers vanished completely without a genetic trace. And when researchers traced who replaced those missing men, who filled that genetic void stretching across an entire continent, what they uncovered is one of the most disturbing patterns in the history of human civilization. It starts with an impossible discovery: the impossible signal. In 2015, Dr. Pontus Skoglund at Harvard wasn't looking for anything extraordinary. He was sequencing ancient Amazonian remains, the kind of work that usually ends with a publication and a pat on the back.
I think the recognition by the Blavatsky Committee is for our work over the past years, bringing ancient DNA into a large-scale genomic science and understanding the human past and the origin of dogs.
But when his algorithm returned results, he leaned forward in his chair, then stood up, then sat back down. The DNA contained genetic markers from Aboriginal Australians. From the opposite side of the planet, he closed the program, reopened it, ran it again. Same results. He called a colleague into the lab and ran it a third time with someone watching over his shoulder. The signal held. Here's why that's impossible. Every textbook said humans entered the Americas through one land bridge from Siberia, roughly 15,000 years ago. One migration, one source population. That was the story. Case closed. But this Australasian signal predated the Siberians entirely. It came from across the Pacific. It shouldn't exist, and yet there it was. Now, here's the catch. The signal doesn't appear uniformly across the Americas. It's concentrated in the Amazon basin, nearly absent everywhere else. If this were just an ancient migration that predated the Siberians, you'd expect traces of it spread across the entire hemisphere: North America, Central America, South America, everywhere. Instead, it's clustered, isolated, hidden in some of the most remote populations on Earth, while almost completely absent from surrounding regions.
From nearly pole to pole. Today, native Arctic peoples belong to the mitochondrial lineage of the Teotihuacanos. Indigenous peoples of Chile and Argentina include the Mayan mitochondrial lineage.
Think about what that means. That pattern tells a deeply disturbing story. These weren't small, marginal populations that arrived and stayed put in the jungle. They were once widespread, potentially everywhere, and they were systematically replaced over thousands of years. Wave after wave of newcomers arriving, mixing with existing groups, erasing those who came before. Layer after layer of genetic history bulldozed and paved over. The only survivors were groups isolated enough, buried deep enough in the Amazon, cut off from the main currents of human movement, that the waves of replacement never fully reached them. Everyone else, overwritten. Graham Hancock had argued this exact pattern for years. He wrote books about it, stood on stages and told rooms full of skeptics that the conventional narrative was wrong, that catastrophic population replacements had occurred repeatedly throughout the Americas. Scientists called him a pseudoscientist, mocked his work publicly, called it dangerous misinformation. But the DNA was telling a different story, and nowhere was this pattern more disturbing than in Mesoamerica, the land that would eventually become the Aztec Empire. What researchers found there makes the Amazonian signal look like a footnote. The erased fathers. Back to Dr. Maria Avila Arcos. When she analyzed Y chromosome data from ancient Mesoamerican remains, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Her coffee sat untouched, going cold. The results populated on screen, and she didn't speak for a long moment. She pushed back from her desk, stood up, walked out of the lab entirely. Her assistant found her in the hallway, staring at the wall. She went back in, sat down, and ran the analysis again. then again, then a third time. Each run hoping she'd find the error, the contamination, the explanation that would make the data make sense. It never came. The male lineages of the Olmec, the builders of Teotihuacan, the early Maya, the Toltec, all of them had vanished from the genetic record, not diminished through natural drift, gone, every single one. Y chromosomes that should have passed from father to son for hundreds of generations had simply stopped, terminated, like someone went through the genetic record with a black marker and deleted entire family trees stretching back centuries. But here's the deal. The female lineages persisted across every collapse, every catastrophe, every civilization-ending event. Maternal DNA survived. Women were absorbed into new populations, married into new communities, carried their heritage forward through daughters and granddaughters. Generation after generation, the mothers endured. The fathers deleted. The warriors, the priests, the kings, removed from the genetic record as if they'd never drawn breath. And this wasn't gradual blending over centuries. That's what normal population mixing looks like. Slow shifts, gentle curves on a graph. Two groups meet, intermarry, and over 10 or 20 generations, their profiles merge into something new. Quiet, peaceful, boring. This was none of those things. The breaks were sharp, sudden. They coincided exactly with moments of civilizational collapse, like someone flipping a switch. One generation, a thriving paternal lineage with deep roots stretching back centuries. The next, completely different men, strangers, as if the original fathers had never existed at all. Think about that for a second. Not a slow fade. Eight's hard cut. Entire populations of men, gone and replaced by strangers within the span of a single human lifetime. If you want to keep uncovering the secrets buried in ancient DNA, subscribe now. Because what comes next in this story is where everything gets truly terrifying. The Teotihuacan massacre. One example stands above all others. Teotihuacan. At its peak around 450 AD, this city held over 125,000 people, rivaling Rome in population and grandeur. The Pyramid of the Sun rising over 200 feet above the valley floor, visible for miles. You could find trade goods stamped with its symbols hundreds of kilometers away. Artists in distant cities copied its style. Foreign rulers name-dropped its authority to prop up their own power. This wasn't just a city. It was the center of everything. The Aztecs, arriving centuries later, were so staggered by the sheer scale of the ruins that they believed only gods could have built them. They named it the place where men became gods. Here's the deal though. Around 550 AD, Teotihuacan didn't decline. It was annihilated. Temples burned so hot the stone cracked. Blood soaked into plaza stones so deeply that chemical traces remain 15 centuries later. Monuments weren't just toppled. They were deliberately defaced with a fury that suggests not conquest, but hatred. Personal hatred. Statues smashed. Sacred spaces desecrated. Entire districts reduced to ash. Whoever did this didn't just want to win, they wanted to erase. And within a single generation, different men were walking those same streets. Different Y chromosomes, different fathers, different bloodlines entirely. The genetic signature didn't drift gradually the way it would through trade or intermarriage. It flipped. Overnight. Complete replacement. Dr. Andres Moreno Estrada at Mexico's National Laboratory of Genomics was presenting these findings at a conference when he stopped mid-sentence. The slide behind him showed a timeline of Y chromosome. Replacements across Mesoamerica. 200 researchers in that room. Dead silence. He described the data as watching a crime committed in genetic slow motion. Except when you zoomed in on individual sites, it wasn't slow at all. One generation to the next. Total erasure. Now picture this. An entire city's worth of fathers, brothers, sons vanished, replaced by strangers who moved into their homes, worshipped in their temples, raised children in their beds, took their wives. The women remained. Their mitochondrial DNA shows unbroken continuity across the collapse. Mothers, daughters, granddaughters, an unbroken chain of women who survived every horror that was inflicted on the men around them. They endured. But their husbands, their fathers, their sons, gone. Systematically, completely, permanently, and get this, the identical pattern appears everywhere researchers look. Maya sites reveal the same sharp Y chromosome breaks coinciding with the classic Maya collapse. Toltec. Genetic signatures vanish abruptly after their empire fell. Mexica paternal lineages disappear without a trace. Each civilization, separated by centuries, hit with the exact same fate. Different peoples, different gods, different languages, same outcome. The men erased, the women kept, the bloodlines restarted with strangers. Pay attention to this next part. War explains some of it. Ancient armies killed men, took women as captives or wives. Over time, that erases Y chromosomes while maintaining maternal DNA. Conquerors become fathers. The conquered become genetic ghosts. But this wasn't skirmishes between neighboring cities. This was a continental pattern, repeating like clockwork across millennia. Each collapse created a genetic vacuum, each vacuum filled by newcomers who dominated, until the next wave arrived and erased them too, then the next, then the next. A cycle of annihilation stretching back thousands of years. And here's the thing that made researchers uncomfortable. Was exactly the kind of cycle Hancock had warned about. The pattern he described in the book after book, catastrophic replacement, not slow evolution, was now staring back at them from the genetic data. But wait until you hear who stepped into the final vacuum. The Aztec genetic conquest. The timing is almost too perfect. The Mexica people, later known as the Aztecs, claimed origin from a mythical northern place called Aztlan. For nearly 200 years, they wandered as outsiders, fighting, serving as mercenaries, getting expelled from one territory after another. Nobody wanted them. Then, in 1325, they founded Tenochtitlan on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco. Here's the thing, they weren't walking into a competitive landscape of powerful civilizations. They were walking into a genetic graveyard. The region had been destabilized by centuries of violence and collapse. Male lineages of earlier civilizations, shattered beyond recognition, surviving populations fragmented there, paternal ancestry broken and replaced multiple times over. The land was full of people, but people whose father lines had been cut, whose communities had been hollowed out, whose power structures had already been dismantled by previous waves of violence. The civilizations that once dominated this region were gone. Their pyramids still stood, their roads still ran. But the men who built them had been genetically erased. And into this fractured landscape came the Aztecs with something nobody else had anymore, intact Y chromosomes. Their male lines hadn't been shattered by conquest. They hadn't been absorbed and diluted over centuries of replacement. They arrived as a coherent genetic unit, a complete paternal lineage in a land where paternal lineages went to die. Fresh blood entering a land of broken bloodlines. And here's what's staggering. They moved fast, terrifyingly fast. Within 2 centuries, they built one of Earth's largest cities, Tenochtitlan, bigger than London or Paris at the time. Causeways stretching across water, aqueducts carrying fresh water for miles, floating gardens called chinampas feeding hundreds of thousands, massive pyramids dominating the skyline, their steps still stained from fresh sacrifices. When Spanish conquistadors first saw it rising from the lake in 1519, Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote that soldiers asked whether the things they saw were not a dream. 2 centuries. From homeless mercenaries to the dominant power on the continent. That's not normal. That's not how empires form. And when you look at the DNA, you start to understand why they rose so fast when everyone before them had fallen. Now here's where it gets really unsettling. As the Aztecs expanded, their male lineages spread across central Mexico like genetic wildfire. They married women from conquered populations, merging their Y chromosomes with the maternal lineages that had survived earlier collapses. Within just a few generations, Aztec paternal ancestry became dominant across their entire growing empire. This wasn't just political conquest. This was biological replacement on a continental scale. Dr. Alexander Ioannidis at Stanford was reviewing data from city-states that fell under Aztec control when he stopped scrolling, sat back, called his team into the room, and pointed at the screen without saying a word. The Y chromosome shifts following Aztec conquest were dramatic, sometimes a complete genetic overhaul within a single generation. Local gene pools reorganized overnight. women from conquered regions showing up in genetic samples from the Aztec heartland. Evidence of large-scale movement of female populations toward the center of the empire. One of his team members asked if the data could be wrong. Ioannidis shook his head slowly. He said the pattern was unmistakable and unlike anything he'd seen at this scale in any population on Earth. He told the room that what they were looking at wasn't just conquest. It was the most complete genetic overhaul of a continental population that modern science had ever documented. And get this, that's not even the most disturbing part. The Aztecs had a tool that made their genetic takeover even more efficient than brute military force: Nahuatl, the Aztec language. When the Spanish arrived, they were stunned at how widely Nahuatl was understood. Traders spoke it, messengers carried it, marketplaces from northern Mexico to Central America echoed with it. Far beyond the reach of any Aztec army, here's why that matters for the DNA. Language travels with people. Merchants, soldiers, administrators, priests, each group carried their genetic heritage along with their vocabulary. Wherever Nahuatl went, Aztec genes followed, and they went everywhere. Into mountain villages, into coastal trading posts, into jungle clearings hundreds of kilometers from the nearest Aztec garrison. Communities that adopted Nahuatl didn't just learn new words, they absorbed new bloodlines, new fathers, new Y chromosomes that overwrote whatever paternal ancestry had survived the previous collapses. DNA confirms this pattern. Regions connected by Nahuatl trade routes show genetic mixing consistent with long-distance movement and intermarriage. The language became a highway for biological replacement, stretching Aztec paternal ancestry across a continent whose original fathers had already been erased. Every marketplace that echoed with Nahuatl was a node in a genetic network. Every trade route was a pipeline for new blood. Think about that. They weren't just conquering territory, they were building an empire of blood. The 15,000-year cycle. Every major revelation in this story keeps pointing in the same direction. Populations replaced, evidence buried, the conventional narrative dangerously incomplete. And every time researchers dig deeper into the genetic record, it gets worse. But the final piece of this puzzle goes somewhere nobody predicted, somewhere that makes everything else in this story feel like a prelude. Here's the part that changes everything. The story doesn't start with the Aztecs. It doesn't start with the Mexica. It doesn't start with any civilization whose name you'd recognize. The Australasian signal that Dr. Skoglund found in 2015, the one that started this entire investigation, is ancient, far older than any known Mesoamerican civilization. It represents contact or migration at the very dawn of human presence in the Americas, possibly 15,000 years ago or more. Pay attention to what that means. That means the pattern of genetic replacement wasn't something that emerged with organized warfare or complex civilizations. It was happening from the very beginning, before cities, before empires, before writing or agriculture or metallurgy, before anyone built anything worth remembering. For at least 15,000 years, populations in the Americas were being rewritten. The genetic slate wiped partially clean, over and over, wave after wave of newcomers, wave after wave of men erased, not as an anomaly, not as an exception, as the rule. Long before the Olmec carved their first colossal head, long before the Maya plotted their first star chart, long before Teotihuacan's first stone was laid, the erasure was already ancient, already routine, already a pattern so deeply embedded in the history of two continents that it might as well have been a law of nature, not a bug in the system itself. Dr. David Reich at Harvard was reviewing the complete data set. Every ancient genome, every Y chromosome break, every maternal continuity line, when he went quiet in the middle of a lab meeting. Not dramatic silence, not a pause for effect. He simply stopped talking and stared at the screen. His colleagues waited. When he finally spoke, he said they were only beginning to understand the true violence embedded in human genetic history. Violence leaving its signature in every sample. Violence written into the blood of survivors. Violence that mainstream archaeology refused to see until the DNA made it impossible to ignore. And here's the question that should genuinely unsettle you. The one nobody is asking yet. If this cycle has been repeating for 15,000 years and the Aztecs were just the latest iteration, who were the first? What population arrived at the very beginning and set this entire chain in motion? That original wave, the one that triggered 15 millennia of overwriting, predates every civilization we have a name for. No texts from them, no oral histories that reach back far enough, no monuments, no art, no trace of who they were or where they came from. Only the faintest ghost of a genetic signal buried in isolated Amazonian populations, slowly being decoded by machines that didn't exist 10 years ago. The Aztecs replaced erased fathers, but someone erased those fathers first, and someone erased the ones before them, and before them. 15,000 years of men disappearing, women surviving, and new bloodlines writing themselves over the old, over and over and over. A cycle so old, it predates human memory itself. The DNA doesn't lie, it can't. And it's telling us that human history is far darker, far more violent, and far stranger than anyone was prepared to accept. The Aztecs were interrupted. Spanish arrival in 1519 ended their expansion. European diseases decimated their population. European weapons destroyed their military. European colonization dismantled their empire before they could complete their genetic conquest. But here's the deal. Their legacy survived. Millions of people today carry Aztec paternal ancestry, bloodlines that spread across Mesoamerica during their brief century of dominance. The Spanish burned their books, destroyed their temples, banned their religion. They tried to erase every trace of Aztec civilization from the face of the earth. But they couldn't erase the DNA. That's the one thing no conqueror can burn. Aztec, Y, chromosomes are still there, still dominant, still marking the genetic landscape of Mexico and Central America 500 years later. The empire fell. The blood endured. And that raises one final, unsettling thought. If the Aztecs were just the latest in a 15,000-year chain of replacers, and the Spanish interrupted them, does that mean the cycle is over, or just paused? We're just getting started pulling these genetic threads. Subscribe now, because next, we're looking at what ancient DNA revealed about the builders of the Egyptian pyramids. And what geneticists found buried in those bones has some researchers questioning everything we thought we knew about who really built them. You don't want to miss that.